The first sound was so ordinary that no one noticed it at first. A dull strike of metal against earth, a tired swing of a shovel beneath the humid Louisiana sun. It was 1867, late summer, the air thick enough to taste dragonflies hovering above the cotton rows like drifting sparks. The men had been working since dawn, boots soaked with sweat and mud, shirts clinging to their backs. They were used to hard ground, used to roots and stones and the stubborn bones of the land. But this felt different. The vibration ran up the wooden handle and into Elias Carter's hands, sharp and unnatural, like the earth had pushed back. He froze. For a moment, the field seemed to fall silent. No wind. No insects. Just the echo of that single metallic clang hanging in the heat. Probably just rock, muttered Thomas Reed, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. He was older, cautious, a man who preferred explanations that allowed work to continue. They had a long stretch left before dusk, but Elias didn't move. He crouched down slowly, brushing away soil with his fingers. The dirt was darker here, packed tighter, not like untouched ground, not like ordinary land. The soil had been disturbed before, years ago perhaps, and then forgotten. Behind them, the distant plantation house stood pale and silent, its windows reflecting sunlight like blank eyes. The war had ended 2 years earlier, but its shadow still lingered across the South. Land had changed hands. Laws had changed. But the ground remembered everything. Dig around it, Thomas said, voice lower now. Elias slid his shovel back in. Careful this time, the blade scraped again. Not rock, not root, wood. A long hollow sound. The men exchanged a look. No one smiled. Wood did not belong this deep in a cotton field. They cleared more soil, inch by inch, sweat dripping. Breathing heavier not from labor now, but from the strange weight pressing down on their chests. A shape began to form beneath the dirt. Straight edges, corners. Deliberate. Elias swallowed. This ain't right, he whispered. By midday, the heat felt suffocating. Word had traveled fast across the field. 3 more workers gathered around the shallow pit, boots scraping against the loosened soil. No one wanted to say it out loud, but every man there knew what shape they were uncovering. A box. Long, narrow. The wood was aged, nearly black, preserved by the damp soil. No markings visible yet. No name. No sign of who had placed it there. Thomas stepped back, jaw tight. Could be storage. Old supplies. No one believed him. The silence stretched thin. Even the cicadas seemed hesitant. Elias brushed the lid gently with his palm. The grain of the wood felt worn, brittle in places, but intact. Whoever buried this had done it carefully. Not rushed. Not careless. A memory flickered in his mind. Stories whispered after dark. About missing people during the war. About graves dug without ceremony. About secrets swallowed by land too vast to question. He pushed the thought away. Should we open it? Someone asked. No, one answered immediately. Because opening meant knowing. And knowing meant something had to be done about it. Thomas looked toward the distant house, then back at the box. Authority was unclear these days. Ownership uncertain. The old plantation master had fled at the war's end. The property was in legal limbo. No one truly in charge. Which meant the decision rested here, in this field, under this sun. Lift it, Thomas said quietly. It took 4 men. The box was heavier than expected, soil clinging to its edges like it refused to let go. They raised it slowly from the earth and set it beside the pit. For a moment, no one moved. Elias knelt again, fingers trembling slightly as he wedged the shovel tip beneath the lid. A pause, a breath. Then he pried. The wood cracked open with a dry snap, and the smell hit first. Old, damp, faint, but unmistakable. The men staggered back inside. Wrapped in decayed cloth were bones. Human. No doubt about it now. A skull tilted slightly to one side, empty eye sockets staring up at the blinding sky for the first time in years. No coffin lining, no cross, just a body placed carefully and hidden deliberately. Silence fell heavier than before. Thomas removed his hat. How many? Someone whispered. They looked back at the pit, and then beyond it, because now that they had found one, the ground no longer looked random. It looked patterned. Elias felt it in his stomach, that sinking realization. He turned slowly, scanning the stretch of land where the cotton grew unevenly, where slight dips and rises disturbed the otherwise flat field. This wasn't alone, he said. And deep down, every man there already knew. They dug again, a few feet over. Another strike. Another hollow sound. By late afternoon, 3 more boxes had emerged from the soil. 4 graves, unmarked, unrecorded, unspoken. The field had not been empty all these years. It had been layered, buried beneath harvest after harvest, season after season, hidden in plain sight. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the rows, the men stood in a loose circle around the uncovered graves. Questions pressed in from every side. Who were they? Why were they here? Why no names? And why in the middle of a working field instead of a proper cemetery? Thomas exhaled. Slowly, voice unsteady now. This land remembers things people tried to forget. No one argued. In 1867, Louisiana was still rebuilding. Records were missing. Courthouses burned during the war. Families displaced. Lives erased without documentation. It would have been easy, too easy, to bury something and let time cover it. But time had shifted. Ownership changed. And shovels had struck where silence once ruled. A breeze finally stirred across the field, lifting dust into the golden light. Elias looked down at the exposed skull again, not with fear now, but with something heavier, responsibility. They shouldn't stay like this, he said softly. Thomas nodded. No, he agreed. They shouldn't. And as dusk settled over the Louisiana fields, the men understood something had changed. This was no longer just another day of labor beneath a punishing sun. The land had given up a secret, and secrets once unearthed demand to be answered. The first grave had been an accident. The second felt like confirmation. By the time the 7th hollow strike echoed across the cotton rows, no one doubted the truth anymore. The field was not simply farmland. It was a resting place, hidden beneath decades of harvest, concealed beneath silence and shifting ownership. The men worked slower now, not out of fear, but out of respect. Every shovel of soil removed felt deliberate, measured. The sun dipped lower, washing the land in amber light, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. They uncovered 7 graves in total. 7 wooden boxes. No markers. No names. Just human remains, carefully placed and forgotten. Elias stood at the edge of the final pit, chest tight. He imagined the day these bodies were lowered here. Who stood nearby? Who watched in silence? Who chose not to speak? Because someone had known. Someone had ordered this. And someone had hoped it would never be foe. Thomas cleared his throat. We tell the town. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. Because what lay beneath this soil was no longer just history. It was evidence. And as night fell over 1867 Louisiana, lanterns flickered to life near the field. Word traveled beyond the rows of cotton, beyond the plantation house, into the nearby settlement where rebuilding lives meant confronting the past. The discovery would raise questions officials did not want asked. It would disturb families who thought grief had ended years ago. It would challenge records that claimed nothing unusual had happened here. But the earth had spoken, and the men who heard it could not pretend otherwise. Elias looked one last time at the uncovered graves, the open boxes resting under dim lantern light. What began as routine labor had transformed into revelation. They had come to work the land. Instead, they had uncovered its memory. And in doing so, they had changed far more than the shape of a field. They had broken silence. They had exposed what was buried. And they understood now with a clarity that settled deep in their bones that some days begin like any other, until the shovels hit something hard. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the field no longer felt like a place of labor. It felt like a place that was watching. A thin layer of mist clung low to the ground, drifting between the cotton rows like something reluctant to leave. The air was cooler than the day before, but heavier somehow, as if the land itself carried the weight of what had been uncovered. Elias arrived first. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hollow darkness of that skull staring upward. Not frightening, not threatening, just waiting. The 7 graves remained exactly as they had left them, covered loosely with canvas sheets to shield them from animals and wandering eyes. The soil around the pits looked darker now in the pale morning light, disturbed earth that could no longer pretend to be untouched. Footsteps approached behind him. Thomas, you shouldn't be here alone, Thomas said quietly. Elias didn't turn. Didn't feel right leaving them alone. Thomas paused at that. He understood. By sunrise, more workers had gathered. Word had spread through the nearby settlement overnight. Not loudly, not publicly, but enough. Men who had worked this land before the war, women who remembered names that never returned, elders who carried stories without proof. They stood at a distance at first, hesitant. No one wanted to step too close to the open graves, not out of superstition, out of respect. A wagon creaked in from the dirt road shortly after. Two town officials stepped down. Mr. Hollis, a clerk barely 30 with ink-stained fingers, and Sheriff Granger, a broad-shouldered man whose uniform still looked too new for the times. Sheriff Granger removed his hat as he approached the pits. "Show me," he said. Thomas led them forward. The canvas was pulled back slowly. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. Hollis swallowed hard, fumbling slightly as he pulled out a small notebook. "7?" Hollis asked. "7 so far," Thomas replied. "So far," the sheriff echoed. Elias stepped forward. "The ground dips further east. We didn't finish checking." The sheriff glanced toward the uneven stretch of field, then back at the graves. "How long you reckon they've been here?" "Maybe more." The sheriff crouched beside one of the boxes, studying the wood. These weren't thrown in. They were placed. That detail mattered. There had been intention here. Deliberate burial. Care taken to conceal, but not to destroy. Hollis scribbled notes nervously. "There's no record of a cemetery on this property," Elias said, his voice calm but steady. "That's the point." A silence followed, the kind that settles when a truth begins to take shape but no one wants to say it out loud. The sheriff stood again. "We'll need to examine them properly. Move them to town." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. One older woman stepped forward, her back slightly bent but her eyes sharp. "Examine them how?" she asked. "Like evidence." The sheriff hesitated, because that was exactly what they were. Evidence. Of something hidden. Of something erased. "These people deserve names," the woman continued softly. "Not just reports." Her words lingered in the morning air. Elias felt something shift inside him. Yesterday the discovery had been shock. Today it felt like responsibility spreading outward. Sheriff Granger nodded slowly. "We'll do it right." But even as he said it, uncertainty flickered in his expression. Louisiana in 1867 was a place of fragile order. Reconstruction had brought change, but it had also brought tension. Records were incomplete, allegiances uncertain. Some truths threatened more than reputations. The wagon was brought closer. One by one, the boxes were lifted carefully. Each movement deliberate. No longer just workers handling lumber, but men carrying lives that had been denied acknowledgement. As the first coffin was raised, something slipped from beneath the decayed cloth inside. A small object fell into the dirt with a soft thud. Elias noticed it first. "Wait." He knelt quickly, brushing soil aside. It was a pendant, tarnished silver, oval-shaped. A faint engraving barely visible beneath corrosion. Thomas crouched beside him. "Can you read it?" Elias rubbed it gently with his sleeve. Letters emerged slowly. M-A-R. The rest too worn to decipher fully. "Mary," the older woman whispered from behind them. Everyone turned. She stepped closer, eyes fixed on the pen. "Aunt, there was a Mary who disappeared during the war. Worked near this land. No grave, no explanation." The sheriff exchanged a glance with Hollis. "Disappeared how?" he asked. The woman's gaze hardened slightly. "Same way many did. No record, no body, just silence." The pendant felt heavier in Elias's palm than it should have, because now the graves weren't anonymous. They were beginning to speak. Sheriff Granger cleared his throat. "We'll catalog everything, personal items included." But something in his tone had changed. Less authority, more caution. As the coffins were loaded onto the wagon, a tension settled over the gathering crowd. Not fear, not anger, expectation. This discovery was no longer confined to a field. It had entered the town's conscience, and with it came questions. Why here? Why hidden? Why unmarked? Hollis flipped through old land transfer documents later that morning in the small town office, dust rising with every page turned. The property had changed ownership twice during the war. Before that, it belonged to a man named Edward Beaumont. Thomas recognized the name immediately. "Beaumont died in '63, Thomas said. "Fever." Sheriff Granger leaned back in his chair. "Any record of deaths on his land?" Hollis shook his head. "Nothing official. Because in times of chaos, unofficial things happened often." Outside, townsfolk gathered in small clusters, voices hushed but urgent. Some faces reflected grief resurfacing. Others carried unease. Elias stood near the wagon as the coffins remained covered, awaiting further examination. He watched the crowd carefully. One man lingered at the edge, dressed neatly, well-fed, eyes calculating. He didn't approach, didn't speak. But he watched. And when Elias met his gaze briefly, the man looked away too quickly. Thomas N. noticed it too. "Who's that?" Elias asked under his breath. "Beaumont's nephew," Thomas replied. "Came back after the war, claims inheritance rights." The air seemed to tighten, because suddenly, the discovery had consequences. Land rights, reputation, money, secrets tied to names and property are another. Sheriff Granger stepped outside, scanning the gathering. "We'll begin examining the remains this afternoon," he announced, respectfully. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the energy remained unsettled. Elias walked back toward the field, briefly, alone again. The pits remained open, 7 dark openings in the earth. He stood at the edge of the first one, staring down into the space where a coffin had rested for years unseen. The land looked ordinary again in daylight, cotton swaying gently, birds circling overhead. But he knew better now. The field was layered with stories, and they had only uncovered the first page. Behind him, footsteps approached once more. It was the older woman. "You were the one who struck it first," she said gently. Elias nodded. She studied him for a moment. "You understand what this means, don't you?" He hesitated. "It means someone didn't want them found." She smiled faintly. "Yes, and now they are." Her gaze shifted toward the town in the distance. When the earth gives up a secret, it's never just about the bones. Because what had begun as a simple strike of metal against wood was becoming something far larger. Not just graves. Not just history. But accountability. And as the wagon wheels finally creaked forward toward town, carrying the 7 silent witnesses, everyone watching understood something quietly but clearly. This was no longer just about what lay beneath the soil. It was about what had been allowed to stay there. And some people, Elias Reali, Zed, would not welcome what came next. By midday, the town felt different, not louder, not chaotic, just tighter. As if something invisible had drawn the air inward and no one quite knew how to release it. The wagon stood behind the small municipal building, its wooden wheels still dusted with soil from the field. The 7 coffins had been carried inside, placed carefully on long tables usually reserved for crop inventories and land disputes. Now, they held something far more delicate than paperwork. Elias stood near the doorway, unsure whether he was meant to be there, yet unable to leave. Inside, Sheriff Granger removed his coat and rolled up his sleeves. Hollis had ink and paper ready, his handwriting steadier now, though his fingers still twitched occasionally when the room fell too silent. Thomas leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching everything without blinking. "Let's proceed," the sheriff said quietly. The first coffin was opened fully under proper light. The bones were arranged carefully, not scattered, not broken. Whoever buried this person had done so with intention, almost tenderness. The cloth wrapping, though decayed, had once been folded neatly. Hollis cleared his throat. "Adult female based on pelvic structure," he murmured as he wrote. Elias shifted his weight. Hearing it spoken so plainly felt strange, reducing a life to structure and fragments. Sheriff Granger examined the skull closely. "No visible trauma," he said at first. But then he paused. "Wait." A thin fracture line traced along the side of the skull, subtle but unmistakable. Thomas stepped forward. "That natural?" The sheriff didn't answer immediately. "It's possible," he said carefully. "But it doesn't look accidental." The room grew still, because now the discovery was shifting, from forgotten burial to possible violence. Outside, footsteps passed along the wooden porch. Voices murmured. The town knew examinations were underway. The waiting was its own kind of tension. The second coffin was opened. Smaller bones. Younger. A child. Elias felt something catch in his throat. The cloth here was thinner, more deteriorated. No jewelry this time. No identifying mark. Hollis hesitated before writing. "Approximately 8 to 10 years of age." The sheriff exhaled slowly. "Any signs?" He examined the ribs, the arms, the fragile skull. "No clear fractures," he said, though his voice had lost some certainty. Thomas looked toward Elias briefly. Neither spoke. Words would have felt inadequate. 7 graves, and at least one child among them. The land had not just hidden secrets. It had hidden sorrow. As the third coffin was opened, A faint metallic clink sounded against the wooden table. Another object, a small brass button, worn but intact. Sheriff Granger lifted it carefully. "That's military," he said quietly. Elias stepped closer. "From the war?" "Possibly." Hollis leaned in. "Confederate." The sheriff turned the button under the lantern light. The emblem was faint, nearly erased by corrosion. "Hard to say," he replied. But the implication hung there. If one of the buried had worn a uniform, it complicated everything. The graves were not a single story. They were layered, mixed. The door creaked open behind them. All heads turned. It was him, Beaumont's nephew, dressed in a dark vest, hat in hand, expression controlled but strained. "I heard you were conducting an inspection," he said evenly. Sheriff Granger straightened. "This is official business." "On my family's former property," the nephew replied. "Former," Thomas repeated quietly. The nephew ignored him, stepping further inside. His eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on the open coffins before shifting away. "This land has changed hands legally," he continued. "Anything found there falls under property review." Elias felt anger flicker in his chest. "People aren't property," he said, voice steady but firm. The nephew's gaze snapped toward him. "No one said they were." "You didn't have to," Thomas added. A silence stretched between them. Sheriff Granger stepped forward slightly. "Until we determine identity and cause. This is a town matter. Be careful what conclusions you draw. Reconstruction has already stirred enough trouble." There it was, not grief, not concern, trouble. Because if these graves suggested wrongdoing, it would not just stain a family name. It could reopen wounds the town was trying desperately to bandage over. "We're not drawing conclusions," the sheriff replied calmly. "We're uncovering facts." The nephew gave a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "Facts have consequences." He placed his hat back on his head. "Good day, gentlemen." But the weight he brought remained. Elias turned toward Thomas. "He's afraid." Thomas nodded. "That means something's there to fear." By late afternoon, patterns began to emerge. Two of the skeletons showed subtle signs of trauma. One adult male with what appeared to be bound wrists at burial. The position of the bones suggested restraint. Another with a fractured collarbone that had never healed. These were not simple deaths from illness or natural causes. At least not all of them. Hollis stopped writing at one point, lowering his pen slowly. "There were reports," he said hesitantly. Sheriff Granger looked up. "Reports of what?" "Disappearances. During the last years of the war. Laborers, travelers passing through, filed." Thomas scoffed quietly. "Convenient confusion." The room darkened as clouds gathered outside. Day blocking the afternoon sun. Lantern light flickered against the walls, casting long shadows behind the coffins. Elias stepped toward the window. The sky had shifted from blue to gray, thick and heavy. A storm building, he felt it mirrored inside the room. Because this was no longer just about 7 graves. It was about what kind of town they wanted to be now. A place that let the past remain buried, or a place willing to confront it no matter how uncomfortable. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Sheriff Granger removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "We'll need to contact state authorities," he said finally. "You sure that's wise? If there's evidence of unlawful death, we can't handle it quietly." Hollis swallowed. "And if it leads back to prominent families, then it leads back." Outside, rain began to fall in slow, deliberate drops. Elias watched it streak across the window glass, blurring the outline of the street. The earth had given up its secret. Now the sky seemed ready to respond. Behind him, the coffins remained open, silent witnesses to conversations that should have happened years ago. Thomas stepped beside Elias at the window. "You ever think," Thomas said softly, "that maybe the land waited until now?" Elias didn't answer immediately, but he understood the question. In 1867, everything was shifting. Old systems collapsing, new ones forming, power uncertain, truth harder to suppress. Maybe the ground had stayed quiet because no one would have listened before. Maybe now someone would. Lightning flashed briefly, illuminating the room in stark white for a split second. In that flash, the bones looked almost alive, not in body, but in presence, demanding acknowledgement, demanding reckoning. Elias turned back toward the tables. He felt it clearly now. This discov. Airy would not fade quietly. It would move through records, through testimonies, through whispered conversations in homes, and public debates in offices. And some would resist it, because truth, once unearthed, reshapes more than history. It reshapes power. The storm outside intensified, rain striking the roof harder now. Sheriff Granger closed one of the coffin lids gently, almost reverently. "We'll continue tomorrow," he said. But everyone in that room knew something had already begun. Something that could not simply be closed again. As the lanterns dimmed and the storm rolled over the town, Elias remained standing a moment longer, staring at the row of coffins. Yesterday they had been hidden beneath soil. Today they were forcing questions into the light. And somewhere beyond the rain-soaked streets, beyond the reach of lantern glow, someone was likely calculating the cost of those questions. Because secrets buried for years do not surface without resistance. And Scene 3 was no longer about discovery. It was about what happens when the truth refuses to go back underground. The storm did not pass quickly. It lingered through the night, rain striking rooftops in restless waves, wind pressing against shutters as if the town itself were being tested. By morning, the streets were slick with mud, the air cool but heavy, charged with something that felt unfinished. Elias walked toward the municipal building again, boots sinking slightly into softened ground. People watched him as he passed, not openly, not boldly, but their eyes followed him, because now he was no longer just a field worker. He was the man whose shovel had struck the first coffin. Inside the building, the atmosphere had changed. Less uncertainty, more gravity. Sheriff Granger stood by the main table, sleeves rolled again, his expression firmer than the day before. Hollis had reorganized his notes, pages, now neatly stacked, as if clarity on paper could bring clarity to the truth itself. Thomas was already there. "You hear?" Thomas asked quietly as Elias stepped in. "Hear what?" "State investigators arriving by noon." Elias felt a subtle tightening in his chest. This was moving faster than expected. "Name's Caleb Whitmore." The sheriff added. "From Baton Rouge. Deals with post-war disputes, missing persons cases." "Does he deal with powerful families?" Thomas asked. The sheriff held his gaze. "We'll find out." Their presence filled the room like silent witnesses waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. Outside, a small crowd had formed again. Not large, but steady. Word had traveled beyond the immediate settlement. Farmers from nearby plots. Merchants. Even a preacher. No one shouted. No one protested. But tension moved quietly through conversations like an undercurrent. Near midday, a carriage rolled into town. Not grand. Not flashy. Practical. A tall man stepped down. Coat dark and neatly pressed despite the damp air. His posture was straight, movements measured. He surveyed the street before approaching the building. Caleb Whitmore did not look rushed. He looked observant. Inside, introductions were brief. "You've seen the remains?" Whitmore asked calmly. "Yes," Sheriff Granger replied. 7 coffins. Possibly more ground to search. Whitmore nodded slowly. "And preliminary findings," Hollis hesitated before speaking. "Signs of trauma on at least 2. 1 child among them. Show me." The first coffin was reopened under his supervision. He examined the bones carefully, without theatrics, without unnecessary commentary. His fingers hovered close but did not disturb anything unnecessarily. "Fracture here," he murmured. "Eye, nidicating the skull. Blunt force, likely intentional." The word settled heavily in the room. Intentional. Not accident, not illness. Thomas exhaled slowly through his nose. Whitmore moved to the next coffin. Bound wrists. He studied the positioning carefully. "This wasn't burial after peaceful passing," he said quietly. "This was concealment." Outside, Beaumont's nephew stood near the edge of the gathering crowd again. He wasn't trying to hide, but he wasn't engaging either. Watching. Calculating. Whitmore noticed him through the window. "That him?" he asked without turning fully. Thomas nodded. "Edward Beaumont's nephew. Claims inheritance." Whitmore closed the coffin lid gently. "We'll speak with him." The air inside the room felt charged now, not with confusion, but with direction. This was no longer speculation. They stepped outside together. The crowd parted slightly as Whitmore approached Beaumont's nephew. "Sir," Whitmore began evenly, "I'd like to ask you a few questions regarding the property prior to and during the war. I was not managing the land during that time." "But your uncle was," Whitmore replied. "Yes, and he is no longer here to answer for anything." The phrasing was careful. "Anything." Whitmore held his gaze steadily. "Were you aware of any burial grounds on the property?" "No." Any reports of missing laborers? Travelers? Conflicts were common. Whitmore nodded slightly. Common enough to bury 7 individuals in an unmarked field? The nephew's composure faltered. Just for a second. I will not entertain accusations based on incomplete information, he replied. No one is. Accusing, Whitmore said calmly. We are establishing facts, but everyone present understood what was really happening. Power was being questioned. Publicly. And that had consequences. Later that afternoon, Whitmore requested access to Beaumont's former records. Ledgers, correspondence, worker rosters. Hollis produced what little remained from town archives. Many gaps, many missing entries, conveniently blank years during the final stretch of the war. Whitmore traced his finger down one list slowly. Notice this, he said quietly to Sheriff Granger and Thomas. 3 names appeared repeatedly in payroll records until late 1864. Then, abruptly, they vanished. No termination note. No death record. Just absence. Elias felt a chill despite the humid air. Cross-reference with the ages of the remains, Whitmore instructed. Hollis flipped through his notes. 2 adult males, aligned closely with those ages, he confirmed. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer confusion. It was recognition. The storm clouds from the previous night had cleared, but something heavier had settled in their place. By evening, word had spread more widely. Conversations moved through town like sparks through dry grass. Some were angry, some simply quiet, absorbing the shift in reality. Because if these graves were the result of violence ordered or permitted by a landowner, it meant the town had carried that truth silently for years, or chosen not to look. Elias walked back toward the field as the sun began to lower again. The pits remained open, rainwater pooled lightly at the bottom. He stood there for a long moment. This place had once felt ordinary. Now it felt sacred, not because of what it hid, but because of what it revealed. Footsteps approached behind him. Whitmore, you're the one who struck the first coffin, he said. Iaz nodded. Whitmore studied the land quietly. History rarely surfaces by invitation, he said. It forces its way up. What happens now? Whitmore's expression was thoughtful. Now we follow it wherever it leads. And if it leads somewhere dangerous, then it leads there. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the cotton rows. For a brief moment, the field looked peaceful again, but Elias understood something clearly now. Peace built on buried truth is fragile. The land had been silent for years. Now it was speaking. And no matter who tried to contain it, dismiss it, or intimidate those uncovering it, the ground had already given up its secret. Scene 4 was no longer about whether something had happened. It was about who would be held accountable for it. And in 1867, Louisiana, that question carried weight far beyond a single field. The following morning brought a strange stillness to the town. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving streets glistening with rain and a faint mist curling around the edges of buildings. The air smelled of wet earth and old leaves, mingling with the faint scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Elias walked toward the municipal building, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the muddy street. Every step felt heavier than the last, weighed down not by the waterlogged ground, but by the knowledge that the events unfolding were far bigger than him, bigger than anyone had anticipated. Inside, Sheriff Granger, Hollis, and Thomas were already at the tables. The 7 coffins lay arranged in careful order, lids partially open for continued examination. Whitmore had arrived earlier than expected, moving with quiet authority, his coat still damp from the mist outside. He glanced at Elias as he stepped in. We need to go deeper today, he said. Evenly, ye. Elias replied, voice steady but low. There's more under the field, and the records hint at more than just these 7. Whitmore nodded. Then we follow the thread. Every lead matters. Thomas shifted uneasily. Some people in town, they'll resist. Not everyone wants history revealed. Resistance doesn't stop truth, Whitmore said. His tone left no room for argument. They began with the first coffin again, this time examining personal items meticulously. The pendant discovered earlier had already been cleaned and photographed by Hollis. Each piece told a fragment of a story. Simple cloth folds, a button from a uniform, faint impressions in the wood suggesting careful handling. Even the smallest details became evidence of intention, of care, or of concealment. The second coffin revealed a rusted locket. Inside, a faded miniature portrait of a young woman stared up. The eyes were haunting, as if accusing those who had unearthed her presence after so many years. Elias held it carefully, feeling an unexpected connection to someone who had lived and died long before him. Whitmore leaned closer, studying the arrangement of the remains. Placement is deliberate. Sequence matters. He traced faint lines in the dirt still clinging to the boxes. They were organized, one after another, not random. Whoever did this wanted them to be found, eventually, or wanted the act recorded in some way, even if indirectly. Careful placement could also mean careful concealment. Prue, Whitmore said, voice low. But concealment and message are not mutually exclusive. Look closer. Markings, positioning, personal effects. They all speak. You just need to listen. Some recognized family names connected to the remains. Others didn't speak, only watched, understanding that what had been buried for decades now demanded attention. Beaumont's nephew returned, this time accompanied by two other relatives. Their approach was measured, polite, but a shadow of unease followed them. They had heard about the examinations and the items discovered, and they understood, implicitly, that the implications could be serious. Whitmore stepped forward to meet them. These graves have surfaced truth that can't be ignored. Cooperation is essential. Obstruction will only worsen the outcome. This land belonged to our family. We will not allow accusations based on incomplete information. No accusations, Whitmore replied. Only facts. The meeting stretched on, words measured, tension thickening the air like the mist outside. Every pause, every careful phrase carried weight. The coffins remained in the room, silent witnesses to negotiations that had nothing to do with mortality, yet everything to do with responsibility and power. Elias moved quietly among the tables, observing. He noted the way light fell across the worn wood, the subtle glint of personal items, the expressions of those around him. Each moment, each glance carried history forward, from the field to the town to the very people who had lived and died in silence. By late afternoon, the first steps toward official documentation had begun. The remains were catalogued meticulously, sketches and notes made, names attempted to be reconstructed where possible. Whitmore worked efficiently, but he never rushed. Each action carried reverence for what had been hidden and what now had to be acknowledged. The storm clouds from the previous night had cleared, leaving the town in golden light. Yet the atmosphere felt far from peaceful. The discovery had opened a wound in the fabric of the two. One's history, one that could not be ignored. Elias stood at the edge of the room, looking down the row of coffins. He felt the weight of responsibility settle over him again. Each strike of the shovel, each uncovered box, each tiny artifact had led to this moment, the intersection of past and present, of buried truths demanding recognition. Thomas came up beside him. Do you think they'll be accepted? The town? Some will, Elias said, voice quiet but resolute. Others, they'll fight. But what matters is that it's out there now. It can't go back in the ground. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room and onto the rain-slicked streets outside, the men realized that Scene 5 was about more than discovery. And in 1867, Louisiana accountability carried consequences far heavier than the weight of any coffin. The next morning, the town seemed to hold its breath. The events of the past days had traveled quickly through whispers and hushed conversations, weaving unease and curiosity together into a tense anticipation. Elias walked toward the municipal building, the soft crunch of his boots on wet gravel breaking the silence, each step echoing the weight of responsibility he carried. Inside, Sheriff Granger, Hollis, Thomas, and Whitmore had already begun reviewing the notes and sketches from the previous examinations. The coffins remained in their careful arrangement, lids partially open, light falling across them in sharp angles that accentuated every crack in the wood, every shadow in the folds of decayed cloth. Whitmore addressed the room. We know what we've found. But the context, why these burials happened here, who ordered them, and who tried to keep them secret, that is what we must uncover next. Elias nodded, feeling a tension that was physical, pressing against his chest. Each coffin told a story. Each artifact, from the tarnished pendant to the brass buttons and locket, offered fragments of identity. But identity alone wasn't the full story. The circumstances of their deaths, the deliberate concealment, the timing during the chaos after the war, all of it pointed to something larger. They began with the first coffin again, lifting the lid fully this time, allowing careful examination of the skeletal remains and personal effects by Whitmore. His hands moved with precision, almost reverence, but never hesitated. Each item was catalogued, photographed, and studied. Notice the arrangement, Whitmore murmured to Elias and Thomas. Each burial is aligned in a pattern. The tallest adults first, the smaller next, and the child placed strategically between. Whoever did this was methodical. Methodical, but why? Possibly to communicate something, Whitmore said.